All right, I think we'll start now. Welcome everyone to a meeting of the Boston Region Metropolitan Planning Organization. I'm David Moore, our Secretary Jamie Tesler here. You're invited to participate in our transportation planning process regardless of your race, color, national origin, including limited English proficiency, religion, creed, gender, ancestry, ethnicity, disability, age, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, veteran status or background. To read the full notice of your rights and protections, please go to www.boston.org/MPO_NON_DISCRIMINATION. All participants will join the meeting with muted microphones. Please rename yourself to include your first name, last name, and affiliation if you have one. After the roll call, board members may mute and unmute themselves. Always remain muted unless actively speaking. To participate in the discussion, please select the raise hand function. Find it by clicking either on the participants button at the bottom of the screen, and a window will pop up with a raise hand button at the bottom, or the reactions button in the toolbar. The chair will then call on participants. If you're on the phone, you can use *9 to raise your hand. If you have any technical difficulties, please contact Jonathan Church via the chat box or at jchurch@ctps.org or call him at 857-702-3709. This meeting is accessible to people with disabilities. Zoom products are compliant with exceptions with the following standards: web content accessibility guidelines level AA standards and revised section 508 standards. If you require any additional accommodations in order to participate fully in this meeting, please contact Jonathan Church of the MPO staff at jchurch@ctps.org or call him at 857-702-3709. Jonathan, before we start, do you want to give a quick update on roll call procedures real quick?
Yes, thank you, David. Just to let everyone know, we had some information that we followed up with the AG's office. We had a staff member attend an open meeting law webinar, and we followed up with them regarding roll call voting. Under the guidelines for the AG's office and the open meeting law, if we have at least 2 people who are attending virtually to a meeting, roll call voting will be required for all action items. So what we will be doing going forward from this meeting on is we will still give all the members the ability to mute and unmute yourselves by making you co-hosts, but we will not be doing yay, nay, or abstain voting. We will have to do it by roll call as long as we're virtual.
Thank you, John. Next item on the agenda is the introductions. Jonathan, please call the roll.
Yes, MassDOT Chair.
This is David Moeller.
Thank you. MassDOT C2.
John Bouchard, representing Highway Administrator Jonathan Gulliver, here.
Thank you. MassDOT Highway Division.
John Romano here.
MBTA.
Good morning. This is Laura Gilmore for the MBTA. I am filling in for Jillian Linnell, who will be joining later in the meeting.
Thank you. Massport.
Hi, this is Sarah Lee for Massport.
MAPC.
Good morning, Eric Barassa with the Metropolitan Area Planning Council.
Thank you. MBTA Advisory Board.
Good morning, Amira Patterson, representing the MBTA Advisory Board, and Brian Kane.
Thank you. Regional Transportation Advisory Council.
Leonard Diggins, representing the MBTA Rider Oversight Committee on the Advisory Council here.
Thank you. City of Boston, BTD.
Good morning, Bill Conroy, representing the City of Boston, and Mayor Michelle Wu.
Thank you. City of Boston, BPDA.
I'm not seeing Jim Fitzgerald or Joe Blankenship.
Okay, move on. At large, City of Everett.
Oh wait, I'm actually seeing James now.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
City of Boston, BTD, BPDA, excuse me.
Hey, sorry for the delay. Jim Fitzgerald with CPDA representing Mayor Wu and City of Boston.
Thank you. At large, City of Everett.
Morning, Jay Monty representing Mayor Di Maria in the City of Everett.
Thank you. At large, City of Newton.
David Kosis representing Mayor Ruth Ann Fuller in the City of Newton.
Thank you. At large, Town of Arlington.
Is Daniel Amstutz representing Select Board Chair Len Diggins in the Town of Arlington.
Thank you. At large, Town of Brookline.
Todd Corain representing Select Board Chair Heather Hamilton in the Town of Brookline.
Thank you. Intercore Committee, City of Somerville.
I'm Bent representing the City of Somerville and Mayor Katiana Ballantyne and the Intercore.
Thank you. Minuteman Advisory Group on Interlocal Coordination, Town of Acton.
I'm not seeing Austin.
Okay. Metro West Regional Collaborative, City of Framingham.
Dennis Giambetti from Metro West Region and representing Mayor Charlie Siski.
Thank you. North Shore Task Force, City of Beverly.
I'm not seeing Darlene Lynn.
Okay. North Suburban Planning Council, Town of Burlington.
I'm not seeing Jen Constable.
Should be Melissa Tentakoulis.
Oh, I apologize. I'm not seeing Melissa either.
Okay, so my next one was South Shore Coalition, Town of Rockland. You're not seeing Jen Constable.
I'm not seeing Jen Constable.
Okay. Southwest Advisory Planning Committee, Town of Medway.
Not seeing Peter Pelletier.
Okay. Three Rivers and Local Council, Town of Norwood, Neponset River Regional Chamber of Commerce.
Hi, Tom O'Rourke from the town of Norwood, representing the Trick Subject.
Thank you. And our ex officio members, Federal Highway Administration.
Good morning, Ken Miller, Federal Highway.
And thank you, and Federal Transit Administration. I believe that calls the roll, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, John. Next item on the agenda is the chair's report, and I don't have one today, so we'll go directly to the executive director's report. Kagan?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome everybody. I'd like to kick off my report with a few celebratory announcements. The first is a staffing update, and I am very pleased to announce that we have hired a new TIP program manager on the MPO activities team. His name is Ethan Lapointe, and he comes to us from Rhode Island DOT, where he's worked as an economic and policy analyst since 2020. And in his role at the RIDOT, he also led a rewriting of the Rhode Island Statewide Transportation Program, or STIP. So he has some nice experience to bring to the table for the MPO. He has not started yet, but we are very thrilled that he will be joining us starting on October 3rd. So we will look forward to introducing him to you all and welcoming him in October. And then another great announcement is that I'm thrilled to report that after much hard work by and coordination between both MPO staff and MAPC staff, we have submitted what I believe to be a very strong application for the Boston Region MPO to the Safe Streets and Roads for All Action Plan grant. It was a very significant effort, and as I mentioned already, very collaborative, and quite a few staff were actually involved in developing various parts of it. So I think that with that, it comes together into a strong application that will bring quite a bit of value to the region in terms of advancing our safety goals. So if, as before, it continues to be, if you have any questions or concerns or want to coordinate or follow up, please don't hesitate to reach out to Rebecca Morgan at rmorgan, MORGAN @ctps.org. And then, Mr. Chair, I have several outreach and engagement highlights related to the events, our federal recertification process, and our long-range transportation planning. But first, I wanted to announce again that the next Transit Working Group quarterly meeting is coming up now this Tuesday, September 20th at 3 p.m. I've mentioned it a few times before. There'll be guest speakers from Transit Ops, which is a nonprofit that works on open source transit tech, and Marco Chitty, who's a transit scholar, and he'll speak about Montreal's recent fare integration. As always, please contact Sandy Johnston if you have any questions at sjohnston, JOHNSTON, @ctps.org. And then I mentioned I have some updates related to our federal recertification process, which happens about every 4 years. I don't want to take Len's update. He may report in his chair report. But yesterday, the Regional Transportation Advisory Council hosted our federal partners for a public meeting as part of that certification process. So again, I'll let him report on that if he'd like to. But the FTA and FHWA will also be hosting a second public meeting or public forum to talk about the certification at the next MPO meeting that we will have on October 6th. So we will have that conversation here in this forum as well to get your input and public input on the recertification process. So the next update I'd like to, update I'd like to provide you is related to a couple of things we're doing related to our long-range transportation plan. So again, the long-range transportation plan also happens around every 4 years, and we expect it to be adopted in 2023. We are starting our fall engagement that we do with these sub-regional groups that are coordinated by MAPC. And during those meetings, we discuss the specific sub-regional transportation priorities and engagement opportunities. And that ends up being an important input into our long-range planning work. So I encourage all of board members to attend those meetings when they are in your sub-region, if you are at all able, and please to help us spread the word. The first set of meetings will be at Magic on October 4th, and then there will be an inner core meeting on October 9th. So please contact Stella Jordan if you'd like more information about those meetings. That's sjordan, JORDAN @ctps.org. And then another announcement in support of the LRTP. We would like to announce that both MPO and MAPC staff have been working together with the state on statewide socioeconomic projections on the committee that's been established there to develop population, household, and employment forecasts for 2050. Those are inputs that will support what we do with the travel demand model to understand future travel and how selected long-range transportation plan projects might influence that travel in the future. So we will be discussing those projections in more detail at some future meetings at the MPO. But for now, we wanted to let municipalities and board members know that in mid-October, MAPC will be sending draft municipal and sub-municipal allocations of populations, household, and employment to you all for review. And they will need feedback by mid-November. So we'll share more details about this as we get closer to it, but we thought we'd give you that heads up so that you feel prepared to provide some of that feedback and input. And then with that, I'll mention that at today's meeting, we will vote to endorse the adjustment to the MPO's federal fiscal year UPWP, which was discussed at the UPWP committee meeting this morning. We'll vote to endorse the amendment to the MPO's public engagement plan, which we'll present on a bit later. And then you'll also hear a presentation from Sandy Johnston on the MPO's travel demand management study that we did on peer MPO practices, and engage you, the board, in a conversation about how you would like to engage with transportation demand management practices. And then finally, as a reminder, the next meeting is on October 6th. And as I mentioned, there will be a forum there for input into the federal certification process. With that, Mr. Chair, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Tegan. Any questions for Tegan? Seeing and hearing none, the next item on the agenda is public comment. Is there anyone from the public who would like to comment at this time? If so, please raise your hand. Kid Miller, you're not really from the public, but go ahead.
Thank you. I just didn't get my hand up in time. I just wanted to encourage folks to participate in, as Tegan mentioned, the certification review. I just want to encourage MPO members to participate in the process. You know, Tegan said that if you had any questions about the certification or comments, that's great. But we're also seeking input on the process itself and what folks think about the MPO process. And so you can participate in the meetings that Tegan mentioned and the actual certification review itself coming up if you wish. But also you can contact Cassie Ostrander of our staff at Federal Highway or Leah Sermon of FTA directly. If you have any thoughts or comments or questions, please free to contact them. You can always find us, just Google FHWAMA and you get a directory. And you can do the same thing with FTA Region 1. So please feel free to contact us directly, but we really do encourage you to participate in the process and the meetings that are available. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ken. Any other comments from the public at this time? Seeing and hearing none. If you want to comment during the meeting, please raise your hand and we'll call on you. Next item is committee chairs reports. Are there any? I think we had a UPWP committee. Derek Schuster.
Good morning. The UPWP committee met this morning and endorsed support for the UPWP adjustment 1 that's on today's agenda. That's it.
Thank you, Derek. Any other committee chairs at this time? Seeing none. Next item on the agenda is the Regional Transportation Advisory Council report. Lynn Diggins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And as our executive director pointed out, we did meet with some representatives from the feds regarding the recertification. And it was a good conversation. You know, my colleagues were surprisingly quiet. So it left a lot of room for me to talk, which will benefit this group when they meet with us in a couple of weeks. But what also I thought was good was that it stimulated me some thoughts about what we could do ourselves. So it's not simply saying, what the MPO needs to do to be better, but what the advisory council as a part of the MPO, but we are a subset we can do to make things better for the advisory council as well as the MPO. So it's good from that point of view. And our next meeting, we will be meeting with Michelle Scott to discuss the visioning or some visions for the LRTP process. And that's about it for now. So thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. Any questions for Lynn? Seeing none. Next item on the agenda is the approval of the MPO minutes for August 4th. Can I get a motion in a second to approve the minutes? Please state your name for the record when making the motion. Eric Barassa.
Eric Barassa with MAPC. I'll make a motion to approve the August 4th MPO meeting minutes.
Amira Patterson.
Amira Patterson from the MBTA Advisory Board, approving the minutes.
Thank you. Motion hasn't been made and seconded. Are there any comments, changes, questions, or suggestions? Seeing none, please call the roll.
Thank you, David. Before I do, I just want to acknowledge that Darlene Nguyen has arrived and wanted to conclude her as the role.
Thank you.
Also, I did misspeak earlier. I did say it was a minimum of 2 persons attending virtually. It's actually only if 1 person attends virtually for the open meeting law requirement. So I just wanted to correct that as well.
Okay, thanks, Jonathan.
Thank you. David Muller.
Yes.
John Bouchard.
John Bouchard, yes.
John Romano.
John Romano, yes.
Laura Gilmore.
Laura Gilmore, abstain.
Sarah Lee.
Sarah Lee, yes.
Eric Barassa.
Eric Barassa, yes.
Mira Patterson.
Amira Patterson, yes.
Leonard Diggins.
Diggins, yes.
Bill Conroy.
Bill Conroy, yes.
Jim Fitzgerald.
Fitzgerald, yes.
Jay Monty.
Jay Monty, yes.
David Kozis.
David Kozis, yes.
Daniel Amstutz.
Daniel Amstutz, yes.
Todd Corain.
Todd Corain, yes.
Tom Bent.
Tom Bent, abstain.
Just a reminder, everybody should be able to unmute and mute themselves. Dennis Giambetti,
Dennis Giambetti, yes.
Darlene Nguyen,
Darlene Wynn, yes.
and Tom O'Rourke.
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
Motion carries, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, John. Next item on the agenda is the Unified Planning Work Program Adjustment Number 1. This you, Jonathan?
Yes, it is. Thank you, Mr. Chair. As Derek Schuster has mentioned, we brought the adjustment 1 to the UPWP committee this morning, who endorsed it for presentation at the MPO. Logan, could you show the table? Thank you. Just to let everyone know, we have made an adjustment to the UPWP based on the fact that we found that some project line item needs have continued to evolve since the approval of Amendment 2 last month. Under that, there's a federal highway allows the adjustment of not more than 25% for each budget item, line item, that is. And this proposed adjustment falls below that threshold. As such, we are looking to increase budget line items for support to the MPO, computer resource management, the Unified Planning Work Program, and the Intersection Improvement Program, congestion management process, and staff-generated research and technical assistance. The various reasons for this for support to the MPO would be to have staff time, prepare for and conduct the in-person certification review, which will be held at the end of this month on the 28th and 9th, as well as some additional work with the Administration and Finance Committee related to the production of the process to create an operations plan. For the computer resources management, the increase would be to support continued work on IT-related projects. For the Unified Planning Work Program, to finalize the UPWP document, particularly related to this adjustment. For the Intersection Improvement Program, it would be to finalize some memos for some intersection improvement recommendations in the towns of Stowe and Wellesley, as well as the city of Woburn. For the congestion management process, we would complete calculations for performance measures for expressway corridors in support for conflation of CMP arterial network. And for staff-generated technical assistance would be to increase to finalize some work products related to the COVID-19 pandemic durable transit ridership research. The remaining projects that you see decreasing in various amounts we'll still have enough budget through the rest of the year to complete the work that is needed for those items in FY 2022, and the net result is a net zero increase in the budget overall for the UPWP. And so with that, I would ask the MPO to please endorse the adjustment. And because it's an adjustment, we will not need to conduct a 21-day public review. And we look forward to the MPO's endorsement. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Any questions of Jonathan? Seeing and hearing none, can I get a motion and a second to approve this adjustment as presented today? And please state your name for the record. Eric Barassa.
Eric Barassa with MAPC. I'll make the motion to approve the UPWP adjustment.
Thank you. Is there a second? Daniel Amstutz.
Daniel Amstutz, I second the motion.
Motion having been made and seconded. Jonathan, please call the roll.
David Moeller,
Yes.
John Bouchard,
John Bouchard, yes.
John Romano,
John Romano, yes.
Laura Gilmore,
Laura Gilmore, yes.
Sarah Lee,
Sarah Lee, yes.
Eric Barassa,
Eric Barassa, yes.
Amira Patterson,
Amira Patterson, yes.
Leonard Diggins,
Leonard Diggins, yes.
Bill Conroy,
Bill Conroy, yes.
Jim Fitzgerald,
Yes.
Jay Monty,
Jay Monty, yes.
David Kozis,
David Kozis, yes.
Daniel Amstutz,
Daniel Amstutz, yes.
Todd Corain,
Todd Corain, yes.
Tom Bent,
Tom Bent, yes.
Dennis Giambetti,
Dennis Giambetti, yes.
Darlene Nguyen,
Darlene Wynn, yes.
and Tom O'Rourke.
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
Motion carries unanimous, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Jonathan. Next item on the agenda is the approval of the public engagement plan amendment. Stella Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning, everyone. So on July 21st, the board voted to release an amendment to the MPO's public engagement plan for a 45-day public comment period. As a reminder, this amendment proposes allowing the board the ability to waive the 21-day public comment period for UPWP amendments. This proposal is in line with federal guidelines around public engagement best practices. During the 45-day public comment period for the amendment, we received one comment letter from the Conservation Law Foundation, which has been included in today's meeting materials for your reference. The letter described concerns that the proposed amendment would limit public engagement opportunities, and it expressed CLF's belief that the MPO had not provided a strong enough justification for why this amendment is necessary. Earlier this week, MPO staff met with CLF staff to discuss their concerns, and we had a productive conversation. So I want to take a moment here to provide the board with the same explanation and context that we provided for CLF. So this proposed change to the UPWP comment period process came from multi-year discussions within the UPWP committee about project scoping and program funding, which resulted in a recommendation from the committee this spring that staff move forward with changing the amendments procedure in the federal fiscal year's 2023 UPWP, and then amending the public engagement plan accordingly. The basis for this change was the recognition that the 21-day public comment period often inhibits the MPO's ability to adjust quickly when priorities and needs shift, often as a result of changes in staff capacity or program expectations. In the past, the lengthy public review process has resulted in staff not being able to pivot to pursue time-sensitive projects, or not being able to produce the highest quality work products due to time constraints. And in recognition of the agility sometimes required to quickly make changes to the UPWP, federal guidelines do not require or recommend public comment periods for UPWP amendments. That said, we are committed to transparency and providing ample opportunities for the public to engage in our processes. So when the UPWP committee recommended that we pursue this change, the expectation was that the 21-day public comment period would still be the default in most cases. What this amendment does is provide the board with the option to waive that public comment period in necessary circumstances. I'll also point out that we are also taking steps to increase transparency and deepen public engagement at all stages of the UPWP cycle, including during the selection, development, and scoping of studies. And this work is being supported by the expansion of our communications and engagement staff over the past year. So with that, I am now requesting that the board move to endorse the proposed amendment to the public engagement plan. And I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Stella. Any questions for Stella? Lynn Diggins.
It's more of a request, and maybe not for what we're doing now, but given that you made, I thought, a very laudable effort to meet with the representative from CLF. I think you gave good answers. Might it be possible in the future when we get these kinds of letters, to publish them and with the response someplace, so that we can easily refer back to them? I know with the auditor, a lot of times they'll send out, they'll do their audit, and then the person audited will respond, and then the auditor will respond, and that's all very easily readable, available. So I'll just suggest something like that for us, because I think it'd be helpful. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. Other questions or comments? Seeing none, can I get a motion in a second to approve this engagement plan amendment as presented today? Eric Barassa.
I'll make a motion to approve the public engagement plan amendment.
Thank you. Lynn Diggins.
I'll second it.
Motion has
second.
been- Thank you. Motion having been made and seconded. Jonathan, please call the roll.
David Moeller,
Yes.
John Bouchard,
John Bouchard, yes.
John Romano,
John Romano, yes.
Laura Gilmore,
Laura Gilmore, yes.
Sarah Lee,
Sarah Lee, yes.
Eric Barassa,
Eric Barassa, yes.
Amira Patterson,
Amira Patterson, yes.
Leonard Diggins,
Leonard Diggins, yes.
Bill Conroy,
Bill Conroy, yes.
Jim Fitzgerald,
Gerald, yes.
Jay Monty,
Jay Monty, yes.
David Kozis,
David Kozis, yes.
Daniel Amstutz,
Daniel Amstutz, yes.
Todd Corain,
Todd Corain, yes.
Tom Ben,
Tom Bent, yes.
Dennis Giambetti,
Dennis Giambetti, yes.
Darlene Nguyen,
Arlene Nguyen, yes.
and Tom O'Rourke.
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
Motion carries unanimous, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Jonathan. Next item on the agenda is a presentation on the travel demand management follow-up by Sandy Johnston. Whenever you're ready, Sandy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning, everyone. I am here to discuss and provide a report on the federal fiscal year 2022 UPWP funded study number 13311, which we creatively titled Travel Demand Management Follow-Up. This study had a budget of $10,000 and was intended to, as the title implies, follow up on the TDM related forums that the MPO hosted during federal fiscal year 2021. There's a research memorandum, which goes over the material I'm going to present today in much more depth, posted on the MPO meeting calendar. So I encourage you to refer to it during the presentation and later if you have not had a chance to review it yet. A brief agenda for this presentation before I jump into it. I'll talk a little bit about the study and its purpose. Then I'm going to present some of the research findings, and we'll wrap up with some discussion of potential directions for the MPO to go from here and what I hope will be a robust conversation. Next slide, please. So I'll start off by briefly recapping this study and what it was intended to accomplish as per the MPO's direction when it was approved. Next slide, please. Before we get too deeply into the content, I want to make sure we're kind of on the same page about the concept of travel demand management, or TDM. So here are two definitions that I came across while doing this research that I thought were insightful. The first is from a recent report on contemporary and equitable TDM practice, which you can find cited on them in the memo. And that says policies and programs, the TDM is policies and programs designed to support and incentivize healthier, more environmentally sustainable transportation behaviors. The second is from a staffer at one of the peer MPOs that we interviewed, and I just found it very concise and elegant. The TDM is quote unquote the behavioral side of transportation planning. The common aspect here, which we'll return to, is the idea that TDM is about behavioral aspects of transportation planning that can be expressed through policies and programs, which are complementing or maybe contrasting to capital investments where you're actually building something. Next slide, please. So now that we have a definition for TDM, let's turn to the purpose of the study as defined in the scope that I presented in December of 2021. Number one, research peer MPO TDM practice. Number two, continue regional stakeholder engagement and document needs related to TDM in the Boston MPO area. Number three, identify potential roles that the MPO and its staff could assume to improve TDM in the region. These points really shape the way that we approach this study and the way that this presentation is structured. First, we tackled peer MPO TDM practice, then looked for some regional stakeholder input, and then we're going to talk a little bit about potential ideas for the board's consideration. Next slide, please. I want to talk a little bit more clearly about what this study is and is not. The study has been about reading, surveying, and listening. What we're presenting here today is for informational purposes. It was not and remains not within the scope to make specific recommendations to the MPO or to put forward a staff favored option for how to proceed. Instead, we wind up by identifying several possibilities and inviting conversations about those and other potential paths forward. Next slide, please. Quick look at where we are in the study process. We've been working on the study since December, and just a couple weeks ago held an open house that I know some of you attended. Going forward from here, we're doing the presentation today, and with the study wrapped up, the MPO will consider which, if any, actions to take in federal fiscal year 2023 and beyond. Next slide, please. So just to give you a sense of the ways we went about this research, and again, this is all documented in much greater detail and with full citations, references, and the like in the memo. For the literature review, we reviewed a couple of older resources from the federal government to develop a list of elements of TDM, discrete pieces of practice that MPOs might engage in, as well as looking at a few newer or emerging documents less focused on MPOs. We used that list of elements to develop surveys geared toward peer MPOs on the one hand and regional stakeholders on the others, and you'll see results in a moment. We then selected 4 MPOs, the Metro Washington Council of Governments in the DC area, the Met Council in the Twin Cities, Missoula, Montana, and Puget Sound Regional Council, which is Seattle and the surrounding area, for further in-depth staff interviews. Likewise, we conducted interviews with several member municipalities who we have granted anonymity so they could respond honestly, and reached many additional regional stakeholders through various events, such as a transit working group coffee chat, the group that we as staff run for Intercore Committee Transportation Planners, and the recent open house specific to this study. Next slide, please. All right, so we're getting to the main content. Let's dig into what we heard from peer MPOs. Going back to those elements of TDM that we identified in the literature review, we sent around a survey to peer MPOs through a couple of listservs, social media, other ways, about which elements of TDM work they engage in, and here are the results. So I know the slide might be a little hard to read, just FYI, this is the same data as figure 2 on page 8 of the memo. The top 5 results from the survey were, number 1, MPOs include TDM in their long-range transportation plan. Number 2, they support or plan for transit-oriented development. Number 3, they develop or maintain TDM performance metrics. Number 4, they provide technical assistance or resources for transit-oriented development. And number 5, they facilitate partnerships or coordination. Next slide, please. All right, so now I want to jump into some of the themes we identified in responses from peer MPOs. These themes and their supporting quotes blend feedback from the open response section of the survey and from other conversations. There are more detailed versions of these graphics that have more quotes in each of the thematic slides in the memo, and I'll give a corresponding figure and page number for each one. For example, this one corresponds to figure 3 on page 12. One thing we heard from peer MPOs is that there should be a purpose to MPO involvement in TDM, and you need to put in the work to build support before launching into the work. There should be support from local partners, from the board, and elected officials. I kind of like the message that's in the red quote on the slide. All of your departments need to work hand in hand, and you shouldn't just put the program up on a shelf to say that you have it. Next slide, please. The corresponding figure for this slide is figure 4 on page 13. Kind of related to the first theme, peer MPOs tell us that there's a need to explicitly define who the stakeholders and target audiences are for a TDM program. One point of emphasis that is captured and in the quotes here and that we heard over and over again from these peer MPOs is that TDM needs to reach beyond the world of white collar 9-to-5 work with which it can be strongly associated at times. Next slide, please. The corresponding figure for this slide is figure 5 on page 14. Several peer MPOs urged us to clearly define the goals and objectives of TDM work before starting it. I want to draw attention to the green colored quotation in the lower right corner, which is, we are studying what the goals of our TDM program should be. Informally, one is making sure that people who benefit from regional funds cooperate regionally. So that emphasizes really the beneficiaries of regional TDM assistance should be expected to act and cooperate regionally in return for receiving that allocation of resources. Next slide, please. Corresponding figure for this slide is figure 6 on page 15. Perhaps the most important thing we heard from peer MPOs, and as you'll see, we heard this from the local perspective as well, was that TDM work must be carefully measured and analyzed by metrics. This is both to sell the work to stakeholders, but also to ensure that the funds and resources allocated are being used well. Some peer MPOs invest significant resources into measurement and data collection around their TDM work. I would say that the Metro Washington Council of Governments invests a huge amount of time and money into tracking their TDM work in very impressive fashion. Next slide, please. So, having talked about our findings from the peer MPOs, let's jump into what we heard from our regional stakeholders. The responses documented here blend things that we heard from the open response portion of the survey, discussions at events, and interviews. Next slide, please. So first, we sent out a survey through several channels to regional stakeholders. It used the same list of elements of TDM as the one sent to peer MPOs, but asked respondents what they would like to see the MPO do. This chart breaks down responses by overall number per element of TDM and which kind of entity, if any, respondents were associated with. The top 5 priorities in these results are nearly identical to those from the peer MPO survey, which asked what elements of TDM MPOs are already doing, although our local correspondents listed including TDM in the congestion management process as their first priority, which knocked support for transit-oriented development down to number 6. The corresponding figure for this slide is figure 7 on page 17 of the report. Next slide, please. Corresponding figure for this slide is figure 8, page 18. We heard just as strongly about the importance of metrics and measurements of outcomes from regional stakeholders as we did from peer MPOs. Some respondents envisioned the MPO as being able to support their application of metrics to their work. Others suggested promulgating shared metrics and training across the region. A lack of staff capacity among our smaller municipalities to implement measures like this was a consistent message, both in surveys and in interviews and conversations. Next slide, please. So the corresponding figure for this slide is figure 9 on page 19. We heard from many respondents that there is a need for someone to foster more coordination between different entities. I thought the green quote on this slide, traffic congestion, air quality issues don't stop at municipal borders, so planners need to look at things regionally, was particularly closely relevant to the MPO's mission. Next slide, please. Corresponding figure for this one is figure 10 on page 20. Several of our respondents made it clear that they feel there's a lack of regional leadership on TDM issues, whether in identifying goals or providing support. And I just want to remind folks that the quotes here are from our correspondents, direct or perhaps a little bit paraphrased, and they are not coming from the staff and do not represent our opinions. Next slide, please. So the corresponding figure for this slide is figure 11 on page 21. Some respondents raised the need for the provision of additional resources on TDM and related planning, including potentially templates for TDM agreements, lots of interest in parking data and support on that, and that should be related to the parking study that we have in the new federal fiscal year 2023 UPWP, and help with data collection. Next slide, please. So the corresponding figure for this slide is figure 12 on page 22. Several of our respondents came through with very interesting ideas about how TDM might be linked to other forms of transportation planning. To a certain extent, this illustrates how TDM can overlap with regular, quote unquote, MPO transportation planning. I want to draw attention to the quote outlined in red, which I thought was kind of a pithy and clever way of framing things. There are 3 reasons employers buy into TDM measures. To be competitive, number 1 is to be competitive in the hiring market. Number 2 is because someone at the company cares about green causes. Number 3 is a shortage of parking. And above all of them is if it's legally required by government. Next slide, please. Okay, so that's a brief summary of what we heard. I do encourage people to check out the memo for more details, both in the body and the appendices, which hold full quotations from our respondents. But now I'd like to move on to invite the MPO board to think a little bit more about the future. The content in the next few slides corresponds to section 3 of the memo, beginning on page 23. Next slide, please. All right. So as I noted at the beginning, the purpose of this study is not and has not been to make a specific recommendation about how the MPO should proceed. But we've been hearing about this issue of a potential desire for the MPO to be involved in TDM for years now, and the MPO funded the study to hear more about what it might be able to do on TDM. So we do want to lay out a few possible paths to facilitate your discussion. We've defined these based on what we heard from peer MPOs and our stakeholders as possibilities, but you should definitely not consider yourselves limited to them. And of course, these are not mutually exclusive options. One or more of them might work in concert. So number one is take no action, and I think that's pretty self-explanatory. The MPO has no statutory requirement or obligation to engage in TDM work. Other entities, MAPC, MassDOT, potentially our transit authorities, might be better placed to take a lead on this issue. Path number two is further study. We as staff can work with MAPC and other stakeholders to determine who might be best to lead and define a path forward. Number three is pursue creation of some kind of TDM program in Destination 2050. So on the staff side, our assumption has long been that the conclusions of the study and discussion might feed into the LRTP that we're currently in the process of developing. That LRTP would then set the groundwork for future MPO resource allocation and priorities. And then number four here, incorporate TDM principles into MPO planning and policy. This is kind of a grab bag of different ideas, specific ideas that we heard from peer MPOs or from stakeholders that could be implemented independent of larger initiatives. So requiring study of TDM alternatives for capital projects. Some MPOs require, or at least have discussed requiring, study of TDM alternatives to capital projects before funding said projects in their TIP. Can the goals of a project be achieved through programs and policy at a lower cost before spending capital funds? B, analyze TDM funding in the TIP. Some MPOs have a dedicated TDM funding program, and some stakeholders said that more funding support would be helpful. The MPO already does fund some projects that might be considered within the umbrella of TDM through its existing funding programs, especially community connections, but it might be worth taking a fresh look at how some of those arrangements work. C, incorporate relevant legislation into MPO planning and requirements. We're perhaps more aware of the relevance of new legislation right now than usual because of the federal infrastructure bill. I wanted to flag this because several stakeholders brought up to us that they thought the MPO should consider codifying one specific piece of legislation, which is the recent MBTA communities transit-oriented development legislation, in its planning process in some fashion, such as by incorporating its requirements into the TIP criteria in some way. I thought that was a very interesting way of looking at TDM. And again, there are more details about that in the memo in section 3. Next slide, please. All right. So all of that being said, this is not an action item. We're looking for your guidance. This is an invitation to discuss, and I am happy to take any questions. We are also requesting that if after dealing with any questions, the MPO discuss and decide upon and direct staff toward a course of action for determining future MPO and staff involvement in the practice of travel demand management. And with that, Mr. Chair, I will hand it back to you for questions.
Thank you, Sandy. Questions for Sandy or comments from MPO members? Eric Barassa.
Yeah, Sandy, thank you. This is a really incredible body of work and something, that's really important to, constantly, kind of follow. I would say I agree with you that I think through the MPO's Community Connections program and some other programs in the past, we have funded many TDM-like, activities, whether it's bike share or bike parking or these first and last mile shuttle connections that we've funded over the years. Some of them, to varying success. I will say, I do think moving forward, I do like the idea of strengthening the relationship between some of our planning activities and the MBTA 3A MBTA communities zoning requirements. MAPC in our part of the UPWP have carved out a little bit of funding that can support some of our technical assistance on that. And we've already identified a few municipalities who are looking for support for to comply. And I think it's really important that it's not just about the zoning around commuter rail stations, but also thinking about how do municipalities incorporate TDM into their local requirements. And so that I think is a good place to kind of strengthen that connection. And obviously, if we continue the community connections program or other programs like that, that could be that's a potential funding source for some of these initiatives. So I think that's an area where we've done something already, and we could potentially strengthen that in the future. My experience with transportation demand management is that it really happens best when the municipality is really almost like requiring it as part of the development process. It's really hard to go back once you have existing developments. There's no leverage to go back and say, oh, you need to do X, Y, and Z. And so that's why I think working with municipalities that are rezoning or looking for development makes a lot of sense. Those are a few thoughts right there. But thank you for this one.
Thank you, Eric. Lynn?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So yeah, this is a great report. We certainly got our money's worth for this one for 10K. But just a quick little burning question and then a couple other comments. You have this quote on page 2 where it says that TDM is a wonky yet useful phrase. Could you tell me what wonky means to perhaps this intersectionality with nerdy?
100% intersectionality with nerdy.
Okay, all right.
Perhaps with an implication of being related to government.
Okay, all right, cool. And so I'll just say that you had a couple of, you quoted someone I think a couple of times that says we don't create reports and plans just to say we've done them, and we don't do that. It's just that we create a report and it gets a lot of fanfare and people are really excited about it, and then for a variety of reasons it loses momentum, or maybe there's a shift in priorities. I'm thinking specifically about the future transportation report because I thought that was a really good initiative. A lot of good ideas came out of it, and maybe it's just not apparent to me what's been done with some of those ideas. Most of those ideas afterwards. But I feel that had in it some good seeds for TDM. And I would like to see us be incorporated into the LRTP, our next LRTP, with emphasis on doing something with as many entities as possible to create a cohesive statewide plan, while at the same time implementing some of these grab bag ideas through the way we score or prioritize projects in the TIP. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lynn. Other comments or questions? Ken Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. 2 questions, Sandy. One, I was just wondering if you had discussions with the TMAs. Those are the folks that we typically consider as implementing TDM kind of strategies around here, given that, I know the state devolved its commute options program a couple of years ago, probably good timing right before the pandemic. And that leads to my second comment, which is that, what we had considered typical TDM kind of strategies have really been stood on their head. Because a typical TDM strategy in the past was, hey, let's get people to telework and let's get people to carpool and let's get people, it's really the demand management, right? Getting people to not travel or not travel at certain times. Well, the pandemic sort of took care of that, right? People are teleworking, and since people are coming in on different days, you really can't carpool that much. It's very hard to do that. So what are the kinds of strategies that you would really think about now? What is the new TDM, I guess, is my question, because some of the things you mentioned in terms of shuttles, the things that the community connections are really supply, not demand management.
Yeah, so to just tackle the second point first, I didn't have it in the presentation, but in the memo, there's a quote that I thought was very provocative from one of the folks at another MPO who I talked to, who said basically that we've been doing TDM as a society for 2 years now. And that to some extent kind of proves the theory of demand reduction, but that there is a need for the field to pivot. And I think where a lot of the folks that I talk to are going is thinking about it, not just as being about commutes, but about going into residential areas and trying to figure out how to make it possible for people to move around for all purposes by modes other than single occupancy vehicle. The problem that I see with that is that it does kind of really continue to blend even more into other forms of transportation planning, and the definition of TDM becomes even fuzzier than it already has been. And to your first question, yeah, I've had extensive conversations with the TMAs. We had several meetings with them during fiscal year 21 when we were preparing for the forums that we did. And we also, they were some of the major attendants at the ICC Transportation Planners meeting where we discussed this at the Transit Working Group coffee chat. I've had, I think I have pretty strong relationships with most of those folks, and we've developed a good rapport about sharing this information.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Daniel Amstutz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Sandy. I participated in the open house a couple weeks ago too, so glad to see this here and see more of the kind of options. I think I was just maybe I was already thinking about this, but when you were talking about just a moment ago about sort of TDM for all kinds of different trips, I was just thinking about the one of the options under option 4 about requiring the TDM alternatives for capital projects. Just to me, that for a lot of things, especially like complete streets projects, that doesn't always make a lot of sense, since you're kind of including things within there like bicycle facilities or better sidewalks or trails that, or bus priority, right? It is essentially trying to move trips away from single occupancy vehicles. So just for that particular option, that doesn't, I mean, it depends on the project. I don't know if it's really, would be a question of sort of the scale or size of the project or the cost of the project, but more like what is the project trying to do? That, it seems like most of our projects are going to be really looking at making those other options easier to do. There's the infrastructure that is the part of that that's needed, that would pair up with the behavioral change that we're trying to make. So that was my thought.
Thank you, Dan. Other comments or questions? Sandy, did you get enough guidance about, I mean, good comments and good discussion, but do you need more from us or are you good?
I think if the MPO is going to proceed with some form of something, I would need a little bit more guidance, but we can also bring that back as part of the LRTP at a future date.
Okay. Lynn Diggins, I see you have your hand up, Lynn. Physically, not
yeah, no, it was absolutely a thumbs up on like making it part of the LRTP discussion, so that's how we can keep the conversation going on it. That's it, thank you.
And I just saw Eric gave the thumbs up too. So Sandy, let's plan on that.
Sounds good, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. What's next on our agenda? I believe it's member items. Is there anyone from any member have an item they'd like to discuss with the MPO at this time? Eric Barassa.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to remind folks about the municipal elections. We are, seeking nominations for the 4 open sub-regional seats. That's the Inner Core subregion, the Magic subregion, the Metro West subregion, and the South Shore Coalition subregion. Nominations are due Monday, October 3rd. We sent out a few communications about that. There's an easy nomination form online. If anyone has questions about that, please contact me. I'm happy to discuss anything. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Any other items at this time? Seeing none, can I get a motion and a second to adjourn? And please state your name for the record when making the motion. Eric Barassa.
I'll make the motion to adjourn. Eric Barassa.
Tom Bent.
And I'll second that motion.
Thank you. Motion having been made and seconded. We are adjourned without objection. Thanks, everybody. See you in a couple weeks.
Full sweeps, Eric, on the motions.
Have a good one.